The blood dripped from Ophelia Crawford's palms onto the rough-hewn log she had just dragged across 50 yards of unforgiving Colorado earth, leaving a trail of crimson dots that soaked into the dry soil, like some grim breadcrumb path leading back to nothing but emptiness. It was August of 1878, and the sun beat down on Fairplay with the kind of relentless heat that made even the strongest men seek shade. But Ophelia had no time for rest, no time for weakness, and certainly no time to acknowledge the screaming protest of muscles that had never been asked to do this kind of work before, 6 months ago. She had arrived in Colorado Territory as a mail-order bride, traveling all the way from Ohio, with nothing but a carpetbag and dreams of a new life, with a man named Gerald Hutchins, who had written her letters full of promises about his prosperous ranch and his kind heart. What she found instead when she stepped off the stagecoach in Fairplay was a grave marker barely 2 weeks old and a sympathetic undertaker who explained that Gerald had been kicked in the head by a spooked horse and died 3 days before she arrived. The money she had spent on the journey had depleted every cent she had saved from 5 years of working in a textile mill, and there was no money for a ticket back east, even if she had wanted to return to the nothing she had left behind. The land, however, was hers. Gerald had signed the deed over to her in his will, 160 acres of rocky Colorado soil at the base of the mountains, far enough from town that neighbors were a concept rather than a reality. The lawyer who handled the estate had looked at her with pity and offered to buy the land for a fraction of its worth, clearly expecting her to take the money and run back to civilization. Instead, she had taken the deed, purchased an axe, a saw, some nails, and as much lumber as her remaining coins could buy, and she had walked the 5 miles to her property with her supplies loaded on a borrowed mule that she returned the next day on foot. That had been in March, when snow still clung to the high peaks and the nights froze the ground solid. She had slept under a canvas tarp for the first 2 weeks, shivering through the darkness and waking before dawn to begin work on the cabin that existed only in her mind. She had never built anything in her life beyond needlework and hope, but she learned through trial and error, through smashed fingers and aching shoulders, through mistakes that cost her precious lumber, and small victories that kept her going one more day. The cabin had taken shape slowly, painfully. 4 walls of logs she had felled herself from the pine forest that bordered her property. Each tree a battle of strength and will, each log a test of her determination to survive in this harsh land without asking anyone for help. She had notched the corners the way she remembered her father describing when she was a child, before he died and left her mother to raise 4 children alone in poverty. The memory of her mother's bent back and tired eyes drove Ophelia forward even when her own body begged her to stop. By June, she had a roof overhead made of split logs and tar paper, walls that kept out most of the wind, a door that hung slightly crooked but closed, and a stone fireplace she had built with rocks hauled from the creek bed. It was rough and ugly and the most beautiful thing she had ever created. She had stood in the center of her 12 by 12-foot cabin and cried for the first time since arriving in Colorado, letting herself feel the triumph and the loneliness in equal measure. Now, in August, she was working on furniture. The platform bed she had built was covered with a straw tick mattress she had sewn from canvas and filled with dried grass. She had a table made from planks laid across log stumps, one chair that wobbled but held her weight, and shelves along one wall where she kept her meager supplies. She hunted rabbits with snares she set near the creek, fished in the cold mountain water, and tended a small garden that struggled in the rocky soil but gave her enough beans and squash to supplement her diet. She had learned to make coffee so strong it could strip paint, and she drank it black because she had no money for sugar or cream. Her hands had transformed over the months. The soft fingers that had once worked delicate stitches were now calloused and scarred, the nails broken and rimmed with dirt that never fully washed away. Her face had browned from the sun despite the bonnet she wore, and her body had grown lean and hard, all softness burned away by the work of survival. She was 23 years old and felt ancient and newborn at the same time. The sound of hoofbeats brought her head up sharply, one hand instinctively reaching for the rifle she kept propped against the cabin wall. Visitors were rare, and in this isolated place, rare often meant dangerous. She watched as a rider crested the small rise to the east, leading a pack horse behind him. He sat tall in the saddle, and even at a distance she could see he wore the dust of long travel. Ophelia wiped her bleeding hands on her trousers, another scandal in a life that had become one long string of improprieties, and waited. Running would do no good, and she had nowhere to run to anyway. She picked up the rifle and held it loosely, not aiming but making its presence known. The rider approached slowly, his hands visible and empty of weapons. As he drew closer, she could make out his features beneath the wide-brimmed hat. He was young, perhaps close to her own age, with a strong jaw darkened by several days of stubble, and eyes that were a startling blue even beneath the shade of his hat. He wore a faded blue shirt and leather vest, chaps over dusty trousers, and there was something careful in the way he moved, as if he was accustomed to approaching strangers who might shoot first and ask questions later. "Madam," he called out when he was still 20 feet away, his voice a deep drawl that marked him as a man from further south than Colorado. "I don't mean any trouble. Saw your smoke from the ridge and thought I might ask if you had any water to spare for the horses. Creek's running low this year, and we have been traveling since dawn." Ophelia studied him for a long moment, her finger near, but not on the rifle's trigger. His eyes were direct but not challenging, and both horses looked tired but well cared for. A man who treated his animals well usually had some decency in him, or so her father had always said. "Creek is down the slope to the west," she said, her voice coming out rougher than she intended. She spoke so rarely that words felt strange on her tongue. "Water's cold and clean. Help yourself." He touched the brim of his hat in thanks and turned his horse toward the creek, but his eyes had caught on her cabin, on the fresh wood shavings scattered around her feet, on her bleeding hands, and the axe embedded in a log nearby. She saw the moment of assessment, the quick calculation of a woman alone in the wilderness, and she straightened her spine and met his gaze with all the steel she had developed over the past 6 months. "Built that yourself?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that was not quite disbelief, but close to it. "I did," she replied flatly. "Every log and every nail." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming it from merely handsome to something that made her heart do an unexpected flutter in her chest. "That is mighty impressive work, madam. Not many men could do what you have done here, let alone a woman." She did not know if she was being complimented or patronized, so she said nothing, just watched as he led his horses toward the creek. She should have gone back to her work, should have ignored him and let him water his animals and ride on to wherever he was going. But instead, she found herself watching the easy way he moved, the gentle murmur of his voice as he spoke to the horses, the competent way he handled the animals. When he returned, his hat pushed back on his head and water dripping from his chin where he had clearly dunked his whole head in the creek, he stopped again at a respectful distance. "Name's Warren Irons," he said. "I have been working a ranch down in New Mexico's territory, but the owner died and his son had his own crew, so I have been heading north looking for work. Heard there might be ranches hiring up in South Park." "Ophelia Crawford," she replied. And then, because she could not help herself, she added, "This is my land, all legal and proper, with a deed filed in town." He held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I am not trying to stake any claim, Miss Crawford. Just introducing myself, proper-like." He paused, his eyes going back to the cabin, and she saw him taking in details she had not noticed he was observing before. "You have done good work here, but I notice you do not have a proper window yet. Getting glass out here is difficult, I would imagine." "I have oiled paper," she said defensively. "It lets in enough light." "Sure enough," he agreed mildly. "And I notice you have been working on extending the cabin." He gestured to the logs she had been moving, to the stakes she had driven into the ground to mark out a new section. "I need more room," she said, though she had not quite articulated to herself what that extra room was for. Storage, maybe, or a place to keep animals when winter came. "Going to add another 12 feet to the south side." Warren whistled low. "That is a lot of work for one person. Those logs need to be notched to join with the existing structure, and you will need to extend the roof line, add support beams." He seemed to be thinking out loud rather than criticizing. "Do you have help coming?" "No," she said simply, because there was no point in elaborating on her complete isolation. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through something in his mind. Finally, he spoke carefully, as if testing the words. "I am not in a particular hurry to get anywhere, Miss Crawford. I have been on the trail for 3 weeks and would not mind a few days of rest. If you were willing to provide meals and a place to lay my bedroll, I would be happy to help you with that addition. I have built plenty of structures in my time, and 2 sets of hands make the work go faster and safer." Ophelia's first instinct was to refuse. She had built her cabin alone, had proven to herself and anyone who cared to notice that she needed no one. But as she looked at the logs, she needed to move, at the careful measurements she had attempted and re-attempted, at her hands that were bleeding from this morning's work alone, something in her wavered. "Why would you do that?" she asked suspiciously. "What do you want?" His expression turned serious. "I want exactly what I said, Miss Crawford. A few good meals, a safe place to rest, and maybe the satisfaction of helping someone who clearly has the grit to survive out here, but could use a hand. I am not asking to share your cabin or anything improper. I will sleep outside with my bedroll, will respect your privacy, and when the addition is built, I will ride on. That is all." She wanted to believe him. More than that, she wanted the help, and the admission of that want felt like failure and relief tangled together. "I do not have much food," she said slowly. "Rabbit stew, beans, cornbread, nothing fancy. I have not had a home-cooked meal in near about a month," Warren said with another of those smiles that seemed to light up his whole face. "Anything that is not hardtack and jerky will taste like a feast." And that was how Warren Irons came to stay on Ophelia Crawford's land, how he unsaddled his horses and turned them into the small corral she had built from aspen poles, how he laid out his bedroll near the fire pit she had dug outside the cabin, a respectful distance away. That evening, she made rabbit stew in her iron pot, thick with wild onions she had found growing near the creek and the last of her precious salt, and they ate in near silence as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made the harsh landscape look almost gentle. Warren complimented her cooking, complimented her cabin again, and asked if she minded him looking at her plans for the addition. She showed him the rough sketches she had made, marks in the dirt and measurements she had written on a piece of scrap paper, and he studied them carefully in the fading light. "Your measurements are good," he said, "but I think we should add a window on the south wall here. It would catch the winter sun and help warm the space. And if we angle the roof just slightly like this," he drew in the dirt with a stick, "the snow will slide off easier come winter, instead of building up weight that could collapse the whole thing." She watched his hands as he drew, noting how sure and steady they were, how his long fingers moved with confidence. "How do you know all this?" she asked. "My father was a carpenter back in Tennessee before the war," Warren said, his voice going soft with memory. "He taught me and my brothers everything he knew about building. I was only 10 when the war started, but I was big for my age, and I worked alongside him rebuilding houses that had been burned. After he died, when I was 16, I headed west and have been working cattle mostly. But I have always hired myself out for building work when it came available. There is something satisfying about making something that lasts, you know? Something that will be standing long after you are gone." Ophelia understood that better than he could know. Her cabin was more than shelter. It was proof that she existed, that she mattered, that she could create something in a world that had always demanded she be small and grateful for whatever scraps were offered. "All right," she said, "we will build it your way." They started work the next morning, as soon as there was enough light to see by. Warren proved to be as skilled as he had claimed, and within the first hour, Ophelia felt both grateful for his help and slightly resentful of how much easier he made tasks that had taken her hours of struggling. He could lift logs she had to drag, could make clean cuts with the saw that took him minutes while the same work had taken her the better part of a morning, but he never made her feel inadequate. Instead, he asked her opinion on placements, showed her techniques for making the work easier, and praised her when she mastered a new skill. "You have got a good eye for level," he told her after she had helped him set a foundation stone. "And your notch work on the original cabin is solid. Whoever taught you knew what they were about." "No one taught me," she said, wiping sawdust from her face. "I figured it out as I went." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her fully, really looked at her, and she saw something like wonder in his expression. "You built that whole cabin without any instruction? Just worked it out yourself?" "I did not have much choice," she said, uncomfortable with the intensity of his gaze. "It was build it or die. Most people would have sold the land and gone back to wherever they came from," Warren said quietly. "What made you stay?" The question hit something deep inside her, something she had not fully examined in the months of backbreaking work. "I had nothing to go back to," she said finally. "And I was tired of being nothing. At least here, I could try to be something, even if I failed." Warren nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had suspected. "You did not fail," he said. "You built yourself a life with your own 2 hands. "That is not nothing, Ophelia. That is everything." The use of her first name should have felt like an intrusion, but instead, it felt like recognition, like being seen as a person rather than an oddity or a problem to be solved. She turned away quickly, blinking against the sudden sting in her eyes. "We should get back to work," she said gruffly. "Daylight is wasting." They fell into a rhythm over the following days. Warren would rise before dawn and have coffee brewing by the time Ophelia emerged from her cabin. They would work through the morning heat, break at midday to eat cold cornbread and drink water from the creek, then work until the sun began to set. In the evenings, Ophelia would cook while Warren tended the horses or repaired a piece of equipment that needed attention. They would eat together, talk a little, and then Warren would retreat to his bedroll while Ophelia disappeared into her cabin. The addition began to take shape quickly with two people working. The walls rose log by log, the corners notched and fitted together with a precision that pleased Ophelia's eye. Warren showed her how to mix clay and moss to chink the gaps between logs, how to set a window frame so it would not warp, how to cut and place roof beams so they would bear weight without sagging. As they worked, they talked. At first, it was just practical matters, discussions of measurements and techniques, but gradually, the conversations deepened. Warren told her about growing up in Tennessee, about his mother who had died of fever when he was 8, about his two older brothers who had both been killed in the war, about his father who had never recovered from losing them and had died of a broken heart more than any physical ailment. He told her about working his way west, about the ranches and towns he had passed through, about the vast loneliness of the frontier and the strange beauty he had found in it. Ophelia found herself sharing things she had never spoken aloud, about her childhood in Ohio, about her father's death in a factory accident, about her mother's slow decline into exhaustion and despair, about the textile mill where she had worked from age 13, about the other women who had saved their money for mail-order marriages, and the ones who had not survived the journey, or had found situations even worse than what they had left. She told him about Gerald Hutchins and the strange grief she felt for a man she had never met, about arriving in Fairplay with nothing but determination and anger, about the first night alone on this land when she had been so terrified she had not slept at all. "Were you not scared out here by yourself?" Warren asked one evening as they sat by the fire, the day's work done, and the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "Especially at first, when you had no walls to shelter you?" "I was terrified," Ophelia admitted. "Every sound was a bear or a mountain lion or an outlaw coming to rob or kill me. But I was also more free than I had ever been in my life. No one telling me what to do, no one taking my wages, no one deciding my worth. The fear was almost worth it for that freedom." Warren was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "I think I understand that," he said finally. "After my father died, I could have stayed in Tennessee, could have found factory work or hired on with one of the big plantations that were starting up again. But I wanted to be somewhere that what I did mattered, where I was not just another pair of hands making money for someone else. I wanted to make my own way." "And have you?" Ophelia asked. "Made your own way?" He shrugged, a slow roll of his shoulders that she had come to recognize as his gesture for uncertainty. "I have not starved, and I have seen country that most people will never imagine. But I have not built anything that lasts, not really. I work a place for a season or a year, move on, and there is nothing left behind to say I was there." "You are building this," Ophelia said, gesturing to the addition that was now nearly complete, its walls solid and its roof beams in place. "This is yours," Warren said, turning to look at her. "I am just helping. When I ride out, this will still be your creation, your accomplishment." "That is not true," Ophelia said, surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "I could not have done this without you. I would have spent months struggling through it, probably made dangerous mistakes, maybe even gotten myself killed, trying to lift something too heavy. You made this possible, Warren. That matters." In the firelight, his eyes were very blue, and when he looked at her, she felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames between them. "You would have figured it out," he said softly. "You are the stubbornest woman I have ever met, Ophelia Crawford. Once you set your mind to something, I do not think anything could stop you." She should have felt offended by being called stubborn, but the way he said it made it sound like a compliment, like a strength rather than a flaw. "My mother used to say my stubbornness would be the death of me," she said with a small smile. "Your stubbornness is what is keeping you alive," Warren replied. Out here, stubborn is the same as strong. The next day was Sunday, and Ophelia suggested they take a day of rest from the heavy construction. Warren agreed readily, and she found herself offering to show him the boundaries of her property, something she had never done for anyone because there had never been anyone to show. They packed a simple lunch and walked north toward the mountains, following the creek through groves of aspen that trembled in the slightest breeze. Warren was easy company, she discovered. He did not feel the need to fill every silence with talk, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and genuine. He pointed out tracks in the mud at the creek's edge, identifying deer and elk and the small paw prints of raccoons. He showed her plants she had not noticed, explained which were edible and which to avoid, shared knowledge he had picked up in his years of traveling. They climbed to a high meadow where wildflowers still bloomed despite the late summer heat, splashes of purple and yellow against the green grass. From this vantage point, they could see for miles, the valley spreading out below them. Ophelia's cabin, a small but distinct structure near the tree line, smoke rising from the fire pit, where she had banked the coals before leaving. "It is beautiful," Warren said, and she could not tell if he meant the view or something more specific. "It is harsh," Ophelia corrected, but without heat. "Beautiful, but harsh. Nothing comes easy here." "The best things never do," Warren said. He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Ophelia, I need to tell you something, and I want you to listen before you respond." Her heart began to beat faster, though she could not have said whether it was from fear or anticipation. "All right. I told you I was heading north looking for work, and that was true when I arrived here. But these past 2 weeks working with you, talking with you, I have been thinking that maybe I have been looking for the wrong thing." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I have been looking for work when what I really needed was a place to belong. And this place, your land, this life you are building, it feels more like belonging than anything I have known since I left Tennessee." "Warren," she began, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish, please. I am not asking to take anything from you or to claim any part of what you have built. This is your land, your cabin, your accomplishment. But I would like to stay, if you will have me. I could help you prepare for winter, build a proper barn for animals, maybe put in a bigger garden for next spring. I have some money saved up from the ranch work, enough to buy supplies and contribute my fair share. We could draw up an agreement, make it all legal and proper, partners in making this place work." Ophelia's mind was racing. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to grasp at this offer of help and companionship and the end of crushing loneliness. But another part of her, the part that had been hurt and disappointed too many times, was cautious. "Why?" she asked bluntly. "You could hire on at any ranch in Colorado. You are skilled and hard-working. Why would you want to stay here and scratch out a living on rocky soil in the middle of nowhere?" Warren looked away, out over the valley, and when he spoke, his voice was low. "Because when I am working with you, I feel like I am building something that matters. Because you make me want to be better than I am. Because I have been alone for so long that I forgot what it was like to share a fire with someone and feel at peace." He turned back to her, and the vulnerability in his expression made her breath catch. "And because I am falling in love with you, Ophelia, and I think maybe you might be feeling something for me too, though I could be wrong about that." The words hung in the air between them, honest and brave and terrifying. Ophelia's first instinct was to deny it, to protect herself from the possibility of pain, but she had built her entire life in Colorado on honesty and hard truth, and she would not start lying now. "I do feel something," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I am afraid, Warren. I came here expecting one kind of life and found something completely different. I do not know if I can trust my own judgment about people anymore." "That is fair," Warren said. "I cannot promise I will never disappoint you or make mistakes. I am just a man, Ophelia, with all the flaws that come with that. But I can promise that I will work hard, that I will respect you and this land, and that I will never try to take from you what you have earned. If you want to draw up a legal partnership, we can do that. If you want time to think about this, I will give you that. I am not going anywhere unless you tell me to go." Ophelia closed her eyes, feeling the sun on her face and the wind in her hair, feeling the solid ground beneath her feet and the rapid beating of her heart. She thought about the past 6 months, about every impossible task she had accomplished alone, about every night she had lain awake wishing for someone to share the burden and the beauty of this place. She thought about Warren's steady hands and kind eyes, about the way he treated her as an equal, about how much easier the work had been with him beside her. "I need time," she said finally, opening her eyes to find him watching her with patient understanding. "Not because I do not feel what you feel, but because this is too important to rush. Stay through the winter. Help me prepare for the hard months. Let us see how we work together when times are difficult, not just when we are building something new. And if, come spring, we both still feel this way, then we can talk about what comes next." A slow smile spread across Warren's face. Not disappointment, but something like relief. That is more than fair. That is wise, actually. Winter in the mountains is a hard test of any partnership. They walked back to the cabin in comfortable silence, but something had changed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing for days but had been carefully unspoken until now. That evening, as they worked together to prepare supper, Ophelia found herself acutely aware of Warren's presence, the way his hand would occasionally brush against hers as they reached for the same pot, the sound of his voice as he told her a story about a ranch he had worked in New Mexico. The addition was completed 3 days later. They hung the door Warren had built, a solid piece of work with leather hinges and a wooden latch, and stood back to admire the structure. The addition made the cabin look substantial, more like a real home than a desperate shelter. The window on the south wall let in streams of afternoon light, and the extra space felt like possibility. "What will you use it for?" Warren asked. "Storage, I thought," Ophelia said, but even as she spoke, she knew that was not quite right. The space felt like it was waiting for something, for a purpose that had not revealed itself yet. Or maybe a workshop, somewhere to work when the weather is bad. "That is practical," Warren agreed. He hesitated, then added, "Though it would also make a fine bedroom, if you ever decided you wanted to move your sleeping area and use the original cabin as a living space." Ophelia looked at him sharply, but his expression was innocent, simply making an observation rather than any kind of suggestion. Still, the comment made her think about how the space could be divided, how two people might live together and maintain propriety, how a home might be shared. As August turned into September, Warren proved true to his word about staying and helping prepare for winter. He built a sturdy barn with space for 2 horses and several milk cows, using lumber he bought in town with his own money despite Ophelia's protests. He reinforced the corral and built a chicken coop with nesting boxes and a section that could be closed off to protect the birds from predators. He helped Ophelia harvest and dry the vegetables from her garden, dig a root cellar into the hillside, and smoke fish and game to last through the cold months. They made trips to Fairplay together, riding in on Warren's horses to purchase supplies and file paperwork that made Warren an official partner in the homestead. The lawyer who drew up the papers looked surprised that Ophelia was willing to share ownership, but she signed firmly, knowing that Warren had more than earned his place through his work and his respect for her autonomy. The people in town had reacted to their partnership with predictable scandal and gossip. A woman living alone with a man who was not her husband was shocking enough, but a woman who owned land and had taken on a male partner rather than simply marrying was nearly incomprehensible. Ophelia held her head high and ignored the whispers, though she saw the way Warren's jaw tightened when someone made a rude comment or gave them a disapproving look. "Does it bother you?" she asked him on the ride back to the cabin after a particularly uncomfortable encounter with the general store owner's wife. "The way people talk about us?" Warren was quiet for a moment, guiding his horse around a rocky outcrop. "It bothers me that they judge you," he said finally, "but their opinions do not matter to me beyond that. We know the truth of our situation, and we are not doing anything wrong. Let them talk." But the talk did bother Ophelia more than she wanted to admit, not because she cared what the townspeople thought, but because some small part of her wondered if they were right to be concerned. She and Warren were not doing anything improper. He truly did sleep in the barn now that it was completed, and they maintained careful boundaries around each other. But the feelings between them had only grown stronger as the weeks passed. And sometimes when she caught him watching her across the fire, or when their hands touched as they worked together, she felt a pull so strong it frightened her. September brought the first frosts, the aspen leaves turning gold and orange, the mornings crisp and cold enough to see their breath. Warren taught Ophelia how to split firewood more efficiently, and together they built a woodpile large enough to last through the winter. He showed her how to bank a fire so it would burn through the night without constant tending, how to read the sky for coming weather, how to prepare for the isolation that winter would bring. One evening in early October, as they sat by the fire after supper, Warren cleared his throat nervously. "There is a dance in town this Saturday," he said, "a harvest celebration. I was wondering if you might want to go." Ophelia's first instinct was to refuse. She had not danced since she was a girl at a church social, and the idea of attending a town event where everyone would stare and whisper was unappealing. But when she looked at Warren's hopeful expression, she found herself reconsidering. "I do not have a dress," she said, which was true. She had been living in men's trousers and work shirts for so long that her one good dress had been packed away and probably no longer fit her changed body. "You would look beautiful in anything," Warren said, then flushed at his own boldness. "But if you want to go into town early, I am sure the dry goods store has fabric. You could make something if you wanted." The idea of sewing again, of creating something pretty rather than purely functional, held an unexpected appeal. "All right," she said, "we can go to the dance." Warren's smile was bright enough to rival the fire. "Thank you," he said softly. "I know it is not easy, going into town, but I want to show everyone that we have nothing to hide. And I want—" He paused, seeming uncertain. "I want to dance with you, Ophelia. I want to hold your hand where people can see and not care what they think." The words made her heart race. "We are not courting," she said, but it came out as a question rather than a statement. "Are we not?" Warren asked gently. "We have been living and working together for 2 months now. We share our meals and our days, our hopes and our fears. The only thing we are not sharing is a name and a bed. And I have been thinking that might be because you are waiting for me to ask proper." "Ask what proper?" Ophelia whispered, though she knew. Warren stood and crossed to where she sat, then lowered himself to one knee in front of her, taking her work-roughened hands in his. "Ophelia Crawford, I love you. I love your strength and your stubbornness, your courage and your kindness. I love the way you face each day like a battle to be won and the way you find joy in small victories. I love working beside you and talking with you and just sitting in silence knowing you are near. I want to spend the rest of my life building something beautiful with you, not just a homestead, but a home, a family, a future. Will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Ophelia's face before she even realized she was crying. Every fear and doubt she had been carrying for months seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the certainty she felt looking into Warren's eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Warren, I will marry you." He surged up and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she cried against his shoulder, releasing months of loneliness and fear and desperate hope. When she finally pulled back, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise. They traveled to Fairplay the next morning and visited the preacher, a kind older man who had always treated Ophelia with respect, despite the scandal of her situation. He agreed to marry them the following Saturday after the harvest dance, and they left his house with the date set and the announcement that would surely send the town gossips into a frenzy. At the dry goods store, Ophelia selected fabric for a dress, a deep green that reminded her of the pine forest surrounding their cabin. The storekeeper's wife, one of the more charitable women in town, offered to help with the sewing, and several other women joined in, creating a dress that was simple but beautiful, with a fitted bodice and a full skirt that would be perfect for dancing. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a crispness to the air that promised winter was not far off. Ophelia dressed carefully in her new gown, pinning her long, dark hair into a style that was more elegant than she had attempted in years. When she emerged from the cabin, Warren was waiting by the barn in his best clothes, his dark hair combed back and his face freshly shaved, and the look in his eyes when he saw her made her feel beautiful in a way she had never experienced before. "You are stunning," he said, offering his arm. "Every man at that dance is going to wish he was me." The dance was held in the largest barn in town, decorated with dried corn stalks and late-blooming wildflowers. A small band played fiddle and guitar, and the wooden floor had been swept clean for dancing. When Ophelia and Warren entered, the room fell quiet for a moment, everyone taking in the sight of the scandalous woman from the mountain and her partner. But then the preacher raised his glass and announced that there would be a wedding the next day, and the mood shifted from judgment to celebration. Warren led Ophelia onto the dance floor, and despite her worry that she would not remember the steps, Her body fell into the rhythm naturally. Warren was a good dancer, confident and graceful, and he guided her through the patterns with ease. Other couples joined them, and soon the floor was full of swirling skirts and stomping boots, the music loud and joyful. Between dances, people approached to offer congratulations, and Ophelia was surprised by how genuine most of them seemed. The storekeeper's wife hugged her warmly. Several men clapped Warren on the shoulder, and even some of the women who had been most critical before seemed to have softened. Perhaps it was the respectability of marriage that changed their opinions, or perhaps it was simply that the community was willing to accept them now that they were making their arrangement legal and proper. As the evening wore on, Ophelia found herself laughing more freely than she had in years, the weight of isolation and struggle lifting as she danced with Warren and accepted the good wishes of their neighbors. When the band played a slow waltz, Warren held her close, his hand warm on her waist, his breath stirring her hair. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly, his lips near her ear. "I am," she said, and realized it was completely true. "I did not think I would ever feel this way again, Warren, safe and happy and hopeful. Thank you." "You do not need to thank me," he said. "You gave me everything when you said yes, a home, a purpose, a future. You gave me your trust, and I know how much that cost you." The wedding the next day was simple and brief, held in the small church with a handful of townspeople as witnesses. Ophelia wore her green dress again, and Warren wore his best shirt and a string tie he had borrowed from the storekeeper. The preacher's words washed over her like a blessing, and when Warren slid a simple gold band onto her finger, she felt like she was finally becoming the person she had been fighting to be since she arrived in Colorado. They rode back to the cabin as husband and wife, the autumn sun warm on their faces, the mountains standing guard around their little valley. Warren had stopped at the creek and picked wildflowers that were braided into Ophelia's hair, and she felt almost like a character in one of the romantic novels she had read as a girl, though her story was harder earned and more real than any fiction. That night, for the first time, Warren did not retreat to the barn. They went together into the addition he had helped her build, into the space that had been waiting for its purpose, and there in the darkness lit only by moonlight through the south-facing window, they came together as husband and wife, their love expressed in touches and whispers and the kind of intimacy that made them one. In the months that followed, as autumn gave way to winter, Ophelia and Warren settled into married life with the same partnership that had defined their working relationship. The snows came heavy that year, drifting against the cabin walls and covering the valley in white that glittered in the sun. They were snowed in for weeks at a time, but they had prepared well, and the isolation felt cozy rather than frightening with Warren beside her. They spent the long winter evenings reading aloud from the few books they owned, playing cards, talking about their dreams for the homestead. Warren wanted to expand the cattle operation come spring, maybe build a larger barn and buy some breeding stock. Ophelia wanted to expand the garden, maybe plant an orchard if they could get young trees to survive the altitude. Together, they made plans and drew sketches and imagined a future that seemed bright with possibility. On the coldest nights, they would lie together in their bed and talk about childhoods and memories, weaving their separate pasts into a shared history. Warren told her about learning to ride when he was 5, about his mother's singing voice, about the taste of his grandmother's peach preserves. Ophelia told him about her father, teaching her to read, about her mother's garden before poverty took even that small joy away, about the dreams she had harbored as a girl before life ground them down. "You are living your dream now," Warren said one night, his arm around her shoulders as they lay in the darkness. "You wanted to be something more than what you were born to, and you made it happen. You should be proud." "We made it happen," Ophelia corrected. "I could not have done this without you, Warren. The cabin, yes, I built that alone. But this, what we have now, the life we are building together, that is something I never could have created by myself." "Then I guess we are both lucky we found each other," he said, and kissed her temple softly. Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow reluctant to release its hold, but eventually the drifts began to melt, the creek swelled with runoff, and green began to appear in patches across the valley. Warren made the trip to town as soon as the roads were passable and returned with supplies for planting, 3 pregnant cows, a dozen chickens, and news that a family had bought the land to the south and would be building a cabin of their own come summer. "Neighbors," Ophelia said, trying to decide how she felt about that. After nearly a year of isolation, the idea of other people nearby was strange. "Good neighbors, from what I hear," Warren said. "A man and his wife with 3 children. They will need help getting established, same as we did. We can be the ones offering assistance this time." The idea pleased Ophelia. She remembered how desperately she had needed help when she first arrived, how pride had kept her from asking, how Warren's offered partnership had changed everything. If she could make the transition easier for another family, that seemed like a worthy way to use the knowledge she had gained. They planted the garden together that spring, twice the size of the previous year, with neat rows of vegetables and a small section dedicated to flowers because Warren insisted that beauty was as important as practicality. The cows gave birth to healthy calves, the chickens laid eggs faithfully, and the homestead began to feel less like a desperate survival experiment and more like a functioning farm. In June, Ophelia realized her monthly courses had not come, and after several weeks of uncertainty, she told Warren her suspicion that she might be carrying their child. His reaction was pure joy, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around despite her laughing protests. They made a trip to town to confirm with the doctor, a careful journey because Warren suddenly treated her like she was made of glass. "I am not fragile," she protested as he helped her down from the horse for the 3rd time. "I built a cabin while you were still in New Mexico, remember?" "I remember," Warren said, but his hand remained protectively on her back. "But you are carrying my child now, and I am going to make sure both of you are safe." The doctor confirmed the pregnancy and predicted a birth in late January. Ophelia was simultaneously thrilled and terrified, remembering stories of women who had died in childbirth, especially in remote areas far from medical help. But Warren's steady presence calmed her fears, and together they began preparing for the new addition to their family. The neighbors arrived in July, a couple named Samuel and Margaret Whitley, with 3 young boys who were excited about the adventure of frontier life. Warren and Ophelia helped them select a building site and taught them the basics of cabin construction, and Samuel proved to be a quick learner with a good work ethic. Margaret was kind and practical, and she and Ophelia formed a friendship built on mutual respect and the understanding that came from both being women who had chosen the hard life of the frontier. By the time the Whitley's cabin was completed in September, the 2 families had become close friends. The children would visit to collect eggs and play with the barn cats. Margaret and Ophelia traded recipes and sewing patterns, and Samuel and Warren helped each other with the heavy work of preparing for another winter. Ophelia's pregnancy progressed well, though the work of the homestead became more difficult as her belly grew. Warren took on more of the heavy tasks, insisting she focus on lighter work, and Margaret often stopped by to help with cooking and preserving food for winter. The community they were building felt precious to Ophelia, a support system she had never had before. Winter came again, softer than the previous year, and Ophelia spent the cold months preparing baby clothes and blankets, her hands remembering the sewing skills from her youth. Warren built a cradle from smooth pine, carving delicate patterns into the headboard, working by lamplight in the evenings while Ophelia knitted. On a frigid night in late January of 1880, Ophelia went into labor. Warren rode through the darkness to fetch Margaret, who had attended several births, and the 2 of them helped Ophelia through the long hours of pain and effort. Just before dawn, Ophelia gave birth to a healthy baby boy with dark hair and his father's blue eyes. They named him Thomas, after Warren's father, and called him Tommy. Warren cried when he held his son for the first time, this big, strong man reduced to tears by the tiny life in his arms. "Thank you," he whispered to Ophelia, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for this gift, for our son, for everything." Ophelia was exhausted but filled with a joy so profound it felt almost painful. Looking at Warren holding their baby, at the cabin they had built together, at the life they had created in this harsh and beautiful land, she felt a satisfaction deeper than anything she had imagined in those desperate early days when she had dragged logs across the dirt with bleeding hands. Tommy proved to be an easy baby, content and healthy, and he thrived in the mountain air. As he grew, Ophelia marveled at the differences between her life now and the life she might have had if Gerald Hutchins had not been kicked by that horse. She might have been a rancher's wife, comfortable perhaps, but never truly a partner. Instead, she had built something entirely her own, had proven her worth to herself before sharing her life with someone who saw her as an equal. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Warren expanded the herd, and the cattle operation became profitable enough that they could afford small luxuries. A new stove for Ophelia, glass windows to replace the oiled paper, store-bought fabric for curtains. They built a second addition to the cabin, creating separate bedrooms because Ophelia was pregnant again. And when she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah in the spring of 1882, the cabin felt full of love and noise and life. More families moved into the valley, drawn by the good grazing land and the sense of community that was developing. A small school was built, and eventually a general store opened closer than Fairplay, making the isolated homestead feel less remote. Warren served on the committee that organized community events, and Ophelia became known as someone who would help new arrivals get established, offering practical advice and occasional assistance. Tommy grew into a sturdy boy who loved working alongside his father, learning about cattle and horses and the land. Sarah was bright and curious, following her mother around the garden and learning the names of plants and how to preserve food. Ophelia taught her daughter to sew and read, and Warren taught both children to ride and rope and all the skills they would need to thrive in this place. One evening in the summer of 1885, 7 years after Warren had first ridden onto Ophelia's land, they sat together on the porch of the cabin, watching their children play in the yard. The original structure had been added to and improved so many times that it was now a substantial house, with multiple rooms and real glass windows and a stone foundation. The barn was large and well-maintained. The garden flourished and cattle grazed across the valley. "Do you remember the first time I saw this place?" Warren asked, his arm around Ophelia's shoulders. "You were dragging logs by yourself, bleeding and stubborn, and I thought you were the most determined person I had ever met. I remember thinking you were going to try to steal my land or worse," Ophelia said with a laugh. "I was so suspicious of your offer to help." "Can you blame yourself?" Warren said. "You had every reason not to trust me, but you took a chance, and look what we built." Ophelia looked at the life spread out before them, at the home they had created and the family they were raising, at the community that had grown up around them. "I built the cabin with my own 2 bleeding hands," she said softly. "But you helped me build everything that made it a home. The addition, our partnership, our love, our children. None of that would exist without you. We built it together," Warren said firmly. "That is what makes it strong. Not what you did alone or what I contributed, but what we created as partners. That is what will last long after we are gone." Tommy called out then, showing them a smooth stone he had found by the creek, and Sarah ran over to demand a story before bed. Warren and Ophelia went inside together, their children between them, into the home that had started as a desperate act of survival and had become something far richer. That night, after the children were asleep, Warren and Ophelia lay in their bed and talked about the future. Tommy would inherit the homestead someday, they agreed, unless Sarah wanted to stay and work the land too. They would need to expand the cattle operation soon, maybe hire help to manage the growing herd. They should plant those fruit trees Ophelia had always wanted, even if they would not bear fruit for years. "Sometimes I cannot believe this is my life," Ophelia said. "When I arrived in Fairplay with nothing but a deed to land I had never seen, I thought I was running out of options. I never imagined I would find this kind of happiness." "You made your own happiness," Warren said. "You built it log by log, just like that first cabin. I was just lucky enough to be traveling through when you needed an extra pair of hands." "You were more than an extra pair of hands," Ophelia said, turning to face him in the darkness. "You were the answer to prayers I did not know how to say. You saw me as capable and strong when everyone else saw me as a scandal or a failure. You loved me when I had forgotten how to love myself." Warren kissed her softly. "Then I guess we saved each other," he said. "You gave me a home and a purpose, and I gave you partnership and support. We are both better together than we ever were apart." As the years continued to pass, Warren and Ophelia's homestead became one of the most successful in the valley. Their children grew strong and confident, raised with the knowledge that hard work and determination could overcome almost any obstacle. Tommy proved to have his father's skill with animals and his mother's stubborn persistence, while Sarah combined Warren's charm with Ophelia's practical intelligence. In 1887, Ophelia discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise at 32, but not an unwelcome one. She gave birth to another son in early 1888, a boy they named Henry, who had his mother's dark hair and serious expression. By then, Tommy was 8 and Sarah was 6, old enough to help with the new baby, and the house rang with the noise and chaos of a growing family. The community continued to develop around them. A church was built, a proper school with a trained teacher, and eventually a small town formed at the crossroads 3 miles from their homestead. Warren served as a part-time deputy, helping maintain order and settle disputes, while Ophelia was elected to the school board, advocating for education opportunities for all children in the valley. They faced hardships, as all frontier families did. A harsh winter in 1889 killed several head of cattle and left them struggling financially until spring. Sarah fell seriously ill with fever in 1890, and for 3 terrifying days they thought they might lose her. But Margaret's nursing skills and Ophelia's fierce will pulled the girl through. A wildfire in 1891 came dangerously close to the homestead, and only the combined efforts of all the families in the valley saved their homes. But through every challenge, Warren and Ophelia faced it together, their partnership strengthened by each trial overcome. They celebrated victories and mourned losses, raised their children and helped their neighbors, and built a life that was rich in everything that truly mattered. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1889, Warren gave Ophelia a gift he had been secretly working on for months. It was a painting he had commissioned from a traveling artist, a detailed image of the original cabin as it had looked when he first arrived, small and rough and surrounded by stumps from felled trees. Beside it, he had added his own sketch of the current homestead, with the expanded house and barn and all the improvements they had made together. "So you never forget what you accomplished," Warren said, as Ophelia stared at the painting with tears in her eyes. "So, our children and grandchildren will know what their mother built with her own 2 bleeding hands before I ever showed up to help." Ophelia could not speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift and the recognition it represented. "I was so alone then," she finally whispered, "so scared and determined and alone. I cannot imagine going back to that life." "You will never have to," Warren promised. "I am here for as long as you will have me, until we are old and gray and watching our grandchildren play in this yard." That vision of the future sustained them through the years that followed. Tommy married at 20, bringing a sweet-natured girl named Annie to the homestead, and they built a cabin of their own on the eastern section of the property. Sarah, independent and determined like her mother, went to Denver to study teaching, though she promised to return to the valley eventually. Henry, the youngest, showed signs of inheriting both his parents' stubbornness and capability, already helping with ranch work at age 10. In 1895, when Ophelia was 40 and Warren was 41, they became grandparents for the first time. Tommy and Annie's son, named Warren after his grandfather, was born healthy and strong, and holding that tiny baby, Ophelia felt the completion of a circle that had begun 17 years earlier when she had arrived in Colorado, with nothing but grief and determination. "Your children's children," Warren said softly, standing beside her as she rocked the baby. "Did you ever imagine this when you were dragging those logs across the dirt?" "Never," Ophelia admitted. "I was just trying to survive one more day. I could not see beyond the next log, the next meal, the next cold night. I never let myself hope for anything like this." "You built more than a cabin," Warren said. "You built a legacy. This land, this family, this community, it all started with you refusing to give up." As the 19th century drew to a close, the valley that had been wilderness when Ophelia first arrived was now a thriving community. The town had a proper main street, several businesses, a hotel for travelers, and even a small newspaper. The Irons homestead, as it was now known despite Ophelia keeping her own name legally, was one of the oldest and most respected in the area. Ophelia and Warren aged gracefully together, their bodies bearing the marks of hard work, but their spirits remaining strong. Ophelia's hands, once soft and delicate, were now permanently rough and scarred, but she looked at them with pride rather than regret. Those hands had built a life from nothing, had created shelter and raised children, and made a mark on this land that would last for generations. Sarah returned from Denver in 1898, bringing with her a husband who was willing to embrace the frontier life, and together they opened a school in the growing town. Henry, at 20, was running most of the ranch operations, proving himself to be every bit as capable as his father. Tommy and Annie had 3 children now, and the homestead rang with the sound of grandchildren playing. On a warm evening in August of 1900, exactly 22 years after Warren had first ridden onto her land, Ophelia and Warren sat together on the porch they had expanded multiple times over the years. They were watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, the same view they had shared for more than 2 decades. "Do you have any regrets?" Ophelia asked, a question she had never voiced before. Warren considered carefully before answering. "I regret the years I wasted wandering before I found you," he said, "but I do not regret anything since the day I asked if you had water for my horses. Every moment since then, the good and the hard, has been exactly the life I wanted to live." "I regret that Gerald Hutchins died before I could meet him," Ophelia said slowly, working through a thought she had never fully articulated. "Not because I wanted to marry him, but because he gave me this land and this chance, and I never got to thank him for that. His death seemed like the worst thing that could happen when I first arrived, but it turned out to be the beginning of everything good in my life." "Life is strange that way," Warren agreed. "The worst moments sometimes lead to the best outcomes. If things had gone according to plan, you would have been Gerald's wife, living in his house, following his rules. You never would have built that cabin, never would have proven what you were capable of, and I never would have fallen in love with the strongest, most stubborn, most wonderful woman in Colorado." Ophelia laughed, a sound that came easily now, after years of happiness. "You forgot to mention the most beautiful woman in Colorado." "That goes without saying," Warren replied, pulling her close. "Though you are even more beautiful now than you were that first day, covered in sawdust and glaring at me like I was a threat to your independence." "You were a threat to my independence," Ophelia said. "You made me realize that independence was not the same as isolation, that accepting help did not make me weak, that partnership could be strength rather than surrender." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. From inside the house, they could hear Henry moving around, preparing for an early morning ride to check on the cattle in the high pasture. From Tommy's cabin, the sound of children laughing drifted on the evening breeze. Somewhere in town, Sarah would be preparing lessons for the next school day, her husband beside her, planning his work at the new lumber mill. "We did good," Warren said softly. "We built something that will last." "We did," Ophelia agreed. "I built my cabin with my own 2 bleeding hands, but you helped me build everything that made it matter. The addition was just the beginning. We built a home, a family, a community, a life worth living. We built it together, and that is what makes it beautiful." Warren kissed her temple, a gesture he had repeated thousands of times over the years, but which never lost its tenderness. "I love you, Ophelia Irons. I have loved you since the day I saw you refuse to be defeated by impossible odds, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too," Ophelia whispered. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Warren. You saw me when I was invisible, valued me when I felt worthless, loved me when I had forgotten how to love myself. You gave me everything." They stayed on the porch until the stars filled the sky. 2 people who had found each other through chance and choice, who had built a life together that neither could have created alone. The cabin that Ophelia had constructed with bleeding hands and desperate determination stood behind them, expanded and improved, but still fundamentally the same, a testament to what one woman could accomplish when she refused to give up. But more than the cabin, more than the successful ranch, or the thriving family, or the legacy they would leave behind, what mattered most was the love they had found in each other, the partnership they had forged through hard work and mutual respect, the life they had created together in the wild and beautiful mountains of Colorado. As they finally rose to go inside, Warren paused at the door and looked back at the valley spread out before them. "Do you remember what you said to me when I asked what you would use the addition for?" "I said storage," Ophelia recalled, smiling at the memory. "You said it was waiting for something," Warren corrected, "waiting for a purpose that had not revealed itself yet. I think we found that purpose, Don, not you." Ophelia looked at the life they had built, at the family they had raised, at the community they had helped create, and she knew he was right. The addition had been waiting for exactly this, for love and partnership and the building of something that would last far beyond their own lives. "Yes," she said, taking his hand and leading him inside. "We found it. We found everything." And so, they lived out their days in the homestead that had started as a desperate act of survival and had become a testament to the power of determination, partnership, and love. They grew old together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, secure in the knowledge that they had built something meaningful and lasting. The cabin that Ophelia had built with her own two bleeding hands stood for generations, expanded and improved by Warren's skilled additions, a physical manifestation of their love story and the life they had created together in the Wild West. And though the frontier eventually became settled and civilized, though the wild days gave way to order and progress, the story of the woman who built her cabin alone and the cowboy who helped her build an addition remained, passed down through their descendants as a reminder that the strongest foundations are built on determination, respect, and the kind of love that sees partnership as the greatest strength of all.